Thank you, and good morning. I'm very happy to be here in Santiago. I grew up on the campus of the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, a small town in southeastern Nigeria. My father was a professor, and my mother was a university administrator. Nsukka was a slow, small, and lovely place, a place of green hills, red dust, hibiscus flowers, mango trees, and a wonderful children's library. I was an early reader. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably closer to the truth. What I read as a very young child were British and American books. I was also an early writer. At the age of 6, I was writing multiple-page stories in pencil with crayon illustrations. And I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They ate apples and played in the snow. They drank ginger beer, because the British characters in the book I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. But I was a child, and like all children, I was vulnerable in the face of a story. Because I had not seen myself reflected in books, I did not think that people like me could be in books. I loved those British and American books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not consciously, actively know that people like me, little girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose gloriously kinky hair did not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. Things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't as easy to find as the foreign books. But because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamaralaye, I slowly went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I began to write stories about people who looked like me, people who ate mangoes instead of apples. That experience from my childhood has taught me the importance of representation, that it matters that we see in the stories we read people who look like us. But I believe it is equally important to see in the stories we read people who do not look like us, because only then can we begin to better understand our complex, diverse world. I did well in school. I was a good student, and like most Nigerian kids who are good students, I was expected to become a doctor. I did not want to be a doctor. All I wanted to do was to write and to read stories. And so at 19, I left Nigeria and went to the US to go to university because I wanted to flee the study of medicine. When I got to the US, my American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I learned to speak English so well. And she was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to some of what she called my tribal African music. And she was very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. Later, she said that it was as if I had not really come from Africa. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a well-meaning, patronizing kind of pity. And I was surprised by how many other people in America, like my roommate, expected me to tell them about poverty because they assumed that to be African was to be poor. To be African was to be defined solely by deprivation. Now, the story of poverty in Africa is an important story, and it is a story that should be told. But it is not my story, and it is not the only story of Africa. The problem with having only one story of a place or a person, a single story, is that it makes it impossible to fully understand that place or that person. But I learned not long afterwards that I too was guilty in having only one story of a place. Years ago, I visited Mexico for the first time. I visited Mexico from the US, and at the time, the political climate in the US was tense, and there were endless debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. Mexicans were all portrayed through a singular lens of negativity. There were stories about Mexicans being arrested at the border, Mexicans bringing disease, Mexicans doing all kinds of negative and horrible things. And so on my first day in Mexico, I remember walking around Guadalajara, admiring the architecture, the market, watching people going to work, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans in America that they had become one thing in my mind: the hopeless immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. I think of literature as my religion, and I have learned from literature that there is no such thing as perfection, that we are all flawed. All of us humans are flawed, but that we do not need first to be perfect before we can do what is right. I have learned from literature that we human beings are not a collection of logical bones and flesh. We are also emotional beings. For every human being in the world, dignity and pride matter as much as food and water. And I have learned to look at the world through the lens of the human story. Recently, again on the subject of immigration in the US, I heard a media commentator say, well, if you don't want your children to be treated terribly at the border, then don't bring them to the border. If we look at that comment through the lens of the human story, it becomes something else, a different story, a story of love, a story of a parent saying, I want more for you, I want better for you, and I am determined to do everything I can to achieve that. It is time for us to hear many stories, time for us to embrace many stories. Recently, a friend of mine, a man from Western Europe, told me that he had bought Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming, and that he had given the book as gifts to all of his female friends. Why only your female friends? I asked him. Why not your male friends? And he looked slightly taken aback. Now, Michelle Obama's memoir is a compulsively readable and gorgeously honest book. And actually, there is a wonderful section about the first kiss between Barack and Michelle Obama, which I think would be a wonderful blueprint for the idea of consent. But this friend of mine is a good and kind man. But to him, the stories of women belong to another universe. We know statistically that men read men, while women read men and women. I believe that if more men read women's stories, then communication would be better between men and women. And dare I be overly optimistic and say that if men read more women's stories, it might lead to a reduced rate of male violence against women, which today is an epidemic almost everywhere in the world. Human stories force us to see people as whole beings, as whole human beings, as equal human beings. We are unfamiliar with one another because we are unfamiliar with the stories of one another. And we must seek multiple stories, many stories, as a way of reminding ourselves of our common humanity. A consequence of not being familiar with the stories of other people is that we then try to silence them. All of us here have experienced a moment in our lives when we felt that someone dismissed us, disrespected us, diminished us. We know that feeling. It can be from the words said, or even merely from how the words are said. And we are all mostly able to interpret our own experiences. And yet, too many times, we try to silence how other people interpret what they experience. And there are many examples on the subjects of racism, sexism. There are many Black people in the world and people of color who have many, many stories of how they have told somebody that they experienced something racist and immediately have that person tell them, "Are you sure? Are you sure it was racism? Are you being a little too sensitive? Are you assuming things?" And many women all over the world have many experiences of talking about something they experienced that they considered sexist and being immediately told, "Are you sure? Aren't you being a little too sensitive?" We also often try to silence the right of people to justified anger. What if, instead of dismissing the anger of people, we asked, why are they angry? Can I understand it? I think that there are unreasonable people in the world, but I just do not believe that large groups of people are simply idiots who feel things for no reason. I was a feminist long before I knew what the word meant, long before I even knew that there was such a word as feminist. I didn't read feminist texts, I simply watched the world. And I knew that the world did not give to women the same dignity that it gave to men, nor the same value. I was aware of how much the socialization of women was focused on men. Don't wear a miniskirt, or you'll be raped by a man. Don't be out late at night, or you'll be assaulted by a man. Learn to cook and clean so you can keep a man. Don't be too ambitious so you don't intimidate a man. Don't always say what you really think, and learn to pretend so as to protect a man's ego. I was aware that the world was not merely male-dominated, but also male-appeasing, so that girls and women were socialized to become complicit in their own oppression, and that because we lived in a world that is misogynistic, it wasn't only men who were misogynistic, women too were misogynistic. A professor on the campus of the university where I grew up, a woman, was often described as arrogant, aggressive, difficult. And there was a professor who was a man who I thought behaved in exactly the same way as the woman. But he was described as authoritative and strong. And so as a child, I very quickly learned that the behavior is often the same, but we judge it differently based on whether it's being exhibited by a man or a woman. And that for women, the judgment is often harsh and has many, many consequences. And so it is time for us to tell different stories. It is time not merely to tell different stories, but to tell the stories differently. It is time for new storytellers. In my language, Igbo, the word for love is ifunanya, and its literal translation is to see. It is important to truly see those about whom we speak and those to whom we speak. It is important to remember that human beings are not just bones of flesh. It is important to remember that we are emotional beings. We all share a desire to be valued, a desire to matter. We will be unable to understand people in need if we speak of them only in terms of their need or in terms of what they lack. We must also know of what they love, what they resent, what wounds their pride, what they aspire to, what makes them laugh. And so to truly see one another, we need to create more space. We need to extend the boundaries. We need to widen our ideas of everything. Some years ago, an American student at a school where I spoke at asked me, "Will you always write about Nigeria, or will you write about more normal things?" And what struck me was that he had a sense of what was normal, and Nigeria was not part of this normal. Now, this student was not an evil person. He meant well, but we can mean well and be wrong. Economic superiority is a fact of our existence, but it can also sometimes give birth to a kind of casual moral superiority. We live in a world today where your value as a human being can often be determined by what passport you carry, what color your skin is, what God you believe in, what your parents did for a living, where you live. And some parts of the world have such cultural and economic power that they end up defining what is normal for everyone else. And it is time to widen our ideas of what normal is. Now, I am not, of course, suggesting that we must agree with everyone. Actually, that would be a very bad idea. And if we had time, I would tell you about all the ideas and people that I strongly disagree with. But we don't have time. What is important here is this, that we must first hear what people are saying. Before I disagree with you, I must first understand you. And to understand you, I must hear you. And so even though I am politically left-leaning, I often read right-leaning books, right-leaning magazines, right-leaning newspapers, because I want to know how people who do not agree with me think. I want to understand them. And of course, I want to be best able to dismantle their arguments. I recently got an honorary degree from a prestigious American university, and at the airport, I was picked up by a driver sent by the university, an older white man. And he was nice and chatty, a little overfamiliar. He asked me what I did for a living, and I said I was a writer. "Oh, I don't read books," he told me. "But even if I read books, I wouldn't read or know about books like yours." "Why do you say that?" I asked him. "Oh, I just know I wouldn't," he said. "Oh, because you think I write about things that would not interest you?" "Yes," he said. And we both know what he meant. Black things and woman things. Now, I thought that this was a moment of remarkable honesty on the subject of identity in America. And so what struck me first was sadness for him. Poor guy, I thought. He's going to miss out on all the wonderful writing of women like Toni Morrison, Arundhati Roy, Ama Atai-Edu, Mary Gateskill. And then I thought about how the reverse could never happen. I read books by white men all the time. Some of my favorite writers are white men. Now, in most societies, white maleness is seen as the norm, and we never assume what white men write about simply by looking at them. And when white men do write about white things and men things, we do not think of that writing as narrowly identity. We think of that writing as universal, which is really how we should think about all good literature. I know from a lifetime of loving books and reading books that any story, if done well, becomes universal. Because in telling stories, we appeal to that which is human in all of us. As a teenager growing up in Nigeria, I read books from all parts of the world, and even though I sometimes didn't understand every specific detail of, for example, Russia in the novel Fathers and Sons, I still got the human story. To read literature and to hear human stories is to try and live in bodies that are not our own. It is to imagine what life is like through the eyes of somebody else. And I think it is very important because in doing so, we remind ourselves that we are not alone. We remind ourselves that we, in the wonderful words of Pablo Neruda, belong to this great mass of humanity, not to the few, but to the many. Thank you.